Now, I don't know if you like peanut butter or not. I have it from time to time. I'm not a big peanut butter fan. I never thought that peanut butter would be a spiritual matter. But I remember a story that Chuck Swindoll told me one day. He was the president of the seminary I studied at. And he told me about a story where some missionaries who happened to love peanut butter eventually were forced to go home, all because of a dispute to do with peanut butter. And I laughed, but as I heard this story, I realized this was no laughing matter for the family that was involved. You see, this particular family headed out from their home country to go overseas to this remote part of the world, and they were a family that happened to like peanut butter. I guess they liked to spread it on their toast in the mornings, maybe some Cruskits with a snack in the afternoon, or maybe even putting it in a satay for family dinner or something at night now and again. And so as they looked around, there were no dairies, there were no supermarkets that stocked peanut butter. So they decided to get some friends to send them some shipments of peanut butter so they could enjoy it on their toast in the mornings. The problem is that some other missionaries in the town thought, well, actually, we don't think you should have peanut butter. Whether it's on your toast or on your Cruskits or in a satay, whatever, no peanut butter. And I guess their thinking was something like this. We sacrificed an awful lot to be missionaries and to come to this country. And if this country has no peanut butter stocked in their, food places, we don't think we should have peanut butter. We consider it a cross to be, bared. We sacrificed, this is kind of where we are. And they took that and they imposed it on all missionaries. Now, this missionary family didn't really buy into that way of thinking. They thought, well, actually, in Jesus, we're actually free to have peanut butter. They didn't flaunt it, they didn't kind of show it off, but they continued to get the shipments and put on their toast and the Cruskits, maybe the satay the odd night, things like that. These other missionaries found out about it. They opened their cupboards, they found the peanut butter, and, it was a terrible deal. It was just as they confronted the family. Why have you still got peanut butter in your household? We told you, and the rest of it. And things got so ugly that this peanut butter loving missionary family had to head back home. The mission they were doing that was really effective all was stopped, all because of peanut butter. It's a tragic story, isn't it? And that story sums up for me something I want to talk about today, which can be summed up in one word: legalism. And behind legalism is this idea that true spirituality can be measured by a list of do's or a list of do-nots. We don't think you should have peanut butter because we're missionaries and we've given up a lot, and it might be a personal choice, but people take that and put it onto a list and they impose that list onto others. Legalism. As you open the Bible and you come to the first 4 books of the New Testament and what we call the Gospels, we often see that Jesus is pretty calm. But there's a particular time or times where, people press his button. And when that button's pressed, he gets peeved off. And what he gets peeved off about is legalists. This rule keeping and the way people take true spirituality to define it by this list of to-dos or do-not-dos. So far in Mark's Gospel that we're going through in this Jaywalk series, there's 5 incidents in Jesus' life where he goes head to head with the religious leaders of the day about legalism. We already have seen one of those 5 incidents a couple of weeks ago when we saw Jesus walk across the room from not engaging so much with the religious leaders, who, the pure white, or at least in their minds, but he engaged and walked across the room with the wild, colorful ones, the tax collectors and sinners. And the tax collectors and sinners weren't liked by people, and for every reason not to be liked, because they were effectively the loan sharks of the day. They skimmed off the top, they took advantage of people, often poor people, and they got rich as a result. Nobody wanted to be around them, but Jesus hung out with them, not because they were fun-loving people, but because he wanted to bring grace and forgiveness to them. That was the first controversy, that Jesus didn't isolate himself, but he incarnated and hung out with, in the legalist minds, the wrong kinds of people. Today, I want to look at another 2 incidents in Jesus' life where he goes head to head with the Pharisees. 2 of these other 5 incidents in Jesus' life where he deals with the subject of legalism. So Mark chapter 2. This is what we read. Once when John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, some people came to Jesus and asked, "Why don't your disciples fast like John's disciples and the Pharisees do?" Apparently back then the Pharisees would fast a couple of times a week, on Mondays, Thursdays, so about 105 days a week they would, fast. And when they fasted, they would make sure they looked pretty miserable. They didn't brush their hair, made sure they looked really bad at what was going on in their life. 105 days a year. Guess how many times the Bible actually spoke about the need to fast back in the Old Testament? Just once. On the Day of Atonement, the whole community was called to fast. But the Pharisees thought, well, this would be a good thing to do. And so they made this rule, Mondays and Thursdays, they kept to that, and they kind of expected true spiritual people to keep that practice as well. So they're asking, well, why don't you join in and why don't you fast like, effectively the spiritual ones do? Jesus responds, "Do wedding guests fast while celebrating with the groom? Of course not. Can't fast while the groom is with them, but someday the groom will be taken away from them and they will fast." His answer is like, have you ever seen anybody fast at a wedding reception? No, they're out there, they're enjoying themselves, they're kind of picking out, they're going back for not just once, but they're going back 2-3 times often to that, table. They're enjoying the meal and there's no frowning, they're just celebrating, they're enjoying the whole thing. So in the same way, these people, that's what we're doing. Because Jesus is saying, I'm the groom, and I'm here to bring a group of people together called the church that I see myself married to, and we're in this relationship and this celebration, and this is the way it should be. And he says, one day I'll go and people will fast again, and throughout church history, people began to fast, and we encourage fasting even here, just as maybe a thing to do. It's no rule, but once a month on second Wednesday as we come and pray and seek God together. But Jesus' point is, you're quick to say, this is a sign of spirituality, but don't measure spirituality by the intensity of your frown and by how bad you look. Don't measure it by some spiritual practice like fasting or whatever else it might be. And he goes on and he talks about some other reasons. And you can see them there in Mark chapter 2. He goes on and gives a couple of examples. One of those examples is around wine. Back in 2,000 years ago, they would have these wineskins. And they'd put this grape juice into these wineskins, and as the wine fermented, the wineskin would expand. And so what would happen is if you took the old wineskins and then you put new unfermented grape juice into that, it would expand again. Obviously, the wineskins can only go out so much. So if you use old wineskins to put new wine in, it would just expand and would burst. It would be this hideous mess. Jesus' point is, you don't fuse me, Jesus, with Judaism. My coming has changed more than just a facade. Don't just kind of tack me on to this old man-made list of do's and do nots and just think that I can kind of come around that. It's a completely new system, whole new way of thinking, whole new approach to spirituality. Jesus is upfront that things have changed. That true spirituality is not measured by the degree of your frown or in the rules that you keep, but in the depth of your relationship with Jesus. It's not about whether you keep that discipline or this discipline, whether it be fasting or whatever it is. It's about your relationship with Jesus. So let's think about relationships for a bit. Whether we're talking about husband-wife relationships or parent-child relationship or friends, the thing is, no two relationships are ever identical. No two relationships are ever the same. What builds and sustains one group of friends is different to what group builds and sustains another friendship, isn't it? I gave somebody in our church a call this week, Alan Parker. Chatted to him on Wednesday night. If you've been around GCC for many, many years, you might remember Alan's first wife by the name of Irene. And I still, even though many, many years have gone by since then, I still hear people talk about Irene and the marriage that Alan and Irene had. It was a good marriage. But when Irene passed away, Alan remarried. And he struck gold again, and he married Kay, and Kay is this, bubbly, friendly person. And people talk about, new marriage being, really good marriage too. So I asked Alan, Alan, tell me about, these two relationships. And he said, well, the first marriage was good, and the second marriage is at least as equally as good, but they're really quite different, because the two women I've married are also very different. And he went on and spoke about some details. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs of Alan's two marriages, but I started to think about this. Now, I would imagine, one marriage might be, you have the kind of quiet evenings at home, reading a book together by the fireplace. But another marriage might be more of the adventuresome, going, canoeing and kayaking and hiking and doing different things. One marriage might be more, you score points by, cleaning up in the kitchen afterwards. With the other marriage, you might score points by, going on a bike ride together. Marriages could be really quite different to each other. What if Alan suddenly sat back and thought, well, actually, I think there might have been a formula to that first marriage. And he starts to identify maybe different things, and who knows what this was in Alan's case, but maybe he thinks, well, this is the way I communicated, this is what I did, this is how we spent time together, and this is what the result is. It might be, I had a date night once a week, we had meals together without the TV on, we prayed together just before we went to sleep. And he might think, well, if I do those things again, this marriage will be just the same. But the second marriage, the person he's married, might be quite different. Might be more spontaneous romance with no weekly date night, but an overseas holiday. It might be eating meals in front of the TV, watching the news, but talking about what's going on in the world. Alan's the same person, but the first wife, second wife, quite different to each other, and so the marriage can be expressed different ways. Healthy marriage, but the things, the tools that work that marriage might be quite different. Now, don't misunderstand me. I think tools are quite important. That's why we as a church provide lots of resources. We have a Faith at Home Centre. It has tools like date nights, things like that back there. But when tools become rules and formulas, something has gone completely wrong. A healthy marriage is not characterized by ticking off whether you do the tools or not. There's a sense of oneness. There's a degree of communication, of trust. That's what healthy marriage is. Now bring that across in our relationship with Jesus for a bit. It's really easy for legalists, peanut butter variety, to define true spirituality by whether we adhere to to-dos or not to-dos. But it's all about the quality of relationship, of trust, of communication. It's not about following the rules that people have set. Legalists step in and they say a relationship with Jesus looks like this. And there's a whole bunch of rules that they make. Rules, tools, formulas. And they bring them all there and they say your experiences with Jesus need to be like this. And these things might be true in their life. And then they take these things and they start to impose them onto people around them. And they say, well, if you do these things, you're following Jesus, you're spiritual. If you don't do these things, you're not really following after Jesus. But Jesus' point is true spirituality is not measured by the degree of your frown, by how miserable you look, or in the rules that you keep, but in the depth of your relationship. There's another incident just after this one where Jesus takes on the Pharisees about legalism. We read this one beginning in verse 23. What Jesus says about the Sabbath and about fences. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through the grain fields, his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?" Now, the problem is not that disciples were stealing some of the grain. That's not the issue here. Back in that time, the Old Testament told farmers back then that you're meant to leave some of the corners of your field so that people that needed something to eat or people that were poor could come by and take some of the grain and have it as part of their meal. So part of a good thing. The disciples weren't breaking any rules doing that. The issue for the Pharisees is that the disciples are plucking these, grains, whatever they're doing with the grain and eating it, and it's a Sabbath day. So question, is there anywhere in the Old Testament that says, thou shalt not pluck heads of grain on the Sabbath? No, there's absolutely nothing. This is what the Old Testament actually said. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you labor and do all your work. The seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. Which is a sideline, you have to say, is a pretty good rule. For our God, the 10 Commandments we talk about, and right on the top 5 of those to have this to say, thou shalt have a day off. That has to be a really good thing. The Pharisees, though, looked at this and thought, what does labor actually mean? And what is work? And so they started to write a whole bunch of rules about what that means. One of those was, effectively, thou shalt not pick grain on a Sunday. Because, when you pick just a little bit of grain, effectively it's like harvesting the entire crop in their thinking. But is, taking a bit of grain and eating, is that the same thing as harvesting? Like the whole field, is it? None of us would see that, but this is how the religious leaders saw this. And so think about what they're doing for a minute. Think about what's going on. They took a genuine commandment. Their intention is good. They're wanting to actually help God out. So over the years, they came up with a whole bunch of laws. This is called the Mishnah. You can read all of the laws and the commandments, the list of to-dos and not to-dos that the legalists of the day set up in the hope that they would keep the actual commandments that God had given. Let me give you some of those. We read things like this. It was forbidden to throw an object in the air with one hand and catch it with the other. That might be work. Weird, isn't it? It was forbidden to have a bath on the Sabbath. My son Chase would be really happy to quote that one. But the reason not to have a bath on the Sabbath is because, maybe the water goes over the bath and then effectively you're cleaning the floor. Go figure. It was forbidden to move a chair, since dragging the chair legs might cause a furrow on the floor, and that would be like plowing, wouldn't it? You can't have that. Can't have a furrow on the, with the chair, so it might be work. And so all of these ridiculous ideas started to come together. 613 laws that they wrote through that time. So I want you to think of it as building a set of fences, like we have up here. Imagine that there is a real danger somewhere. So, back over here, let's imagine, though you can't see it, there is a manhole right here under this rug. That if I stepped on this rug, man, I would be going down, I'd break my leg, it'd be like history for me. This is a genuine danger sign. So, you expect to see danger here, keep out, because we don't want anybody to get hurt. But what legalists do is they say, we kind of know that, but we want to make sure people don't get too close. So they put up an extra layer of fences to make sure that we don't get too close. And then they put up another danger sign to say, hey, there's something behind this fence that if you cross this fence, something bad's going to happen to you because you're way too close to the danger back there. And so there's another layer, another fence is put up with the intention, good intention, that people don't get too close to breaking their neck. And then they put up another fence they cross. And they say, don't get too close, and, kind of step back a little bit further and then roll the way over here. And they say, actually, the danger's way back here. Don't cross this line, because if you cross this line, something bad is going to happen to you. Now, how do most of us work? Most of us like to, test the boundary lines, don't we? At least I do. And so, throughout my life, so somebody would tell me this, and you tend to get pretty close to it, don't you? And eventually you find yourself stepping over. And you're like, I don't see any manhole, I'm still safe. And before you know it, you start to check, maybe, in this case, the Bible, and you go, well, I don't see anything about a manhole right here. There's nothing that prevents this. I'm free to be in here. Which starts to raise questions. Well, maybe this other fence isn't quite right either. So you actually jump over the next one. And you think, well, this must be okay. And sure enough, there's no manhole here either. So you start to question what's been given, and you can flick through the Bible and you don't see anything there. So you cross over the next one. And again, same thing. It's all good. And so you don't even check anything anymore. Don't even read the Bible. You just assume that this is going to be safe too. And before you know it, you're in danger. That's effectively, I think, how legalists work and why it doesn't work. In my history, I've seen legalists in different generations and different cultures come up with a whole bunch of different rules. In my parents' generation, the list, like for the Sabbath, for Sundays, was don't play card games, don't play with any toys, no shopping, no movies, no sports, no reading, no knitting, no alcohol. Wear your best clothes to church services. How it was in my parents' day. A lot of fences coming back here from a commandment that was way back over here that one day we'll talk about what that looks like for today. In my teenage years, things had changed a bit. It's like one of the fences had been removed to say, actually you can do some of those things now. You can go to some movies, but as long as they have a G or PG, then it's okay. You can go to some dances as long as it's just kind of in a barn. You can do some things following Jesus, but, rules back. Today, I don't hear a lot of the don't do's, but I hear a lot of do's. Pray in this prayer formula. Pray in this prayer language. Journal, because really spiritual people do that. Sponsor a child in need, because everybody should be doing that. Have this particular spiritual gift and practice it in this particular way. Be passionate and smile all the time, because true spiritual people do that. And the list changes from culture to culture, from generation to generation, from place to place, but it's still a list. And it's a list of man-made, people-driven rules to say this is what spirituality is, this is what spirituality isn't, that has nothing to do with what God actually says. This is not the approach that Jesus had. He criticizes the Pharisees for it again and again and again. So how does Jesus respond to this incident about plucking grain on a Sabbath? He says, haven't you read in the Scriptures? Because, the religious leaders knew the Scriptures, or they thought they did. They just didn't read it well. They point to all these things that Jesus is doing wrong from the Scriptures, just they're not reading it. It's intended. Read the Scriptures, what David did when he and his companions were hungry. He went to the house of God during the days. It goes on, talks about the context. And he broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. He also gave some to his companions. Now, all the Jews loved David. He was king. He was an amazing guy. So to quote anything from David's life, very significant. And Jesus said, remember that time where, there was that bread, the showbread that was to go in the temple, and only priests were allowed to eat that. But David and his men one day, they're running from Saul and they're hungry, haven't eaten. They come and they actually eat some of that showbread. And God doesn't seem to be upset about it. It seems to be okay. It's one of those times where maybe the letter of the law is broken, but certainly the spirit of the law is not broken. And so Jesus says, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. You're on my case about grain, eating some grain on a Sabbath, all because of your own man-made rules, but this isn't what the Sabbath's about. The Sabbath's about resting, about refreshing, about realigning with God. And you're so obsessed with what is work and what is labor and trying to build all these fences to stay away from the issue, but rather than asking, how do we follow what God actually says? How do we seek rest? How do we find rest? How do we be refreshed in this relationship with Jesus? They lost the point. or because they put all these fences up in the hope that they would help God to get people to obey the commandment, rather than how do we actually obey the commandment as the issue that God was most concerned about. I love the way the Apostle Paul puts it. He says this: don't handle, don't taste, don't touch. And some of us at this point might be going, yeah, that's exactly the way it should be. And then Paul says, such rules are mere human teachings about things that deteriorate as we use them. These rules may seem wise. They may seem wise because they require strong devotion, pious self-denial, and severe bodily discipline. But look at what Paul says. They provide no help, zero help in conquering a person's evil desires. You know, that's my experience. To many, it looks wise. To many, it looks spiritual. And the genuinely spiritual ones will be the ones that kind of follow that. But, you know, one church I went to, their fence that they put up said, no dancing. This is only like 10 years ago too. And the youth group were invited by another youth group to go to a barn dance, which is actually pretty tame. The leaders of this church said, no, you can't go because we have a line in the sand, no dancing, because, well, there's just no dancing. And so you know what happens, youth being youth, they thought, well, you know, they didn't show that they were going to do it, but they jumped over the fence. And they went to this other youth group's barn dance. And they had a good time. And they looked at the Bible and thought, well, we don't see anything about going to a barn dance being prohibited here. They question everything. And they question a whole lot on the next layer. And the next layer. And over a few years, it's pretty predictable, they crossed this layer here. And the layer here was about lust and about listening to what God said around sexuality. They broke that too because they tossed out everything. Or because some rules have been set up way up here that weren't really necessary. Man-made rules, but not God-made rules. That happens again all the time. The bottom line is this: true spirituality is not measured by the way you keep behind man-made fences, but in your actual obedience to what God says. I mean, God does say what's right and what's wrong. Obey Him. Jesus says, you know, all who love me will do what I say. That's important. When we put all these man-made rules, whether it's 2,000 years ago or whatever they are today, about what we're to do or not to do, when those become the issue, and then we define people to be spiritual and not based on these man-made issues, we'll become an accidental Pharisee. Legalism says true spirituality can be measured by particular things you do or don't do. Might be good things, but they're not God things. I know only too well how easy it is to become an accidental Pharisee. Easy for it to happen. No one wants to be an accidental Pharisee. It's not on anyone's bucket list that I know of. Easily happens. And it happens particularly to people who know the Bible well, just like it did to these people back here. And the journey normally starts off innocently enough. It begins with this desire to follow Jesus and to be like towards the front line of the people following Jesus. So we step out in faith. We make some big changes. We have different areas of our lives cleaned up and we don't compromise, and we have particular experiences that are really precious to us, and we put in place different spiritual disciplines, these tools that, again, are really helpful to our journey, our relationship with Jesus. So far, so good. But as we press forward in following Jesus, we start to look back, and we see in this line of people a few lagging behind. And in fact, they don't seem to have the same intensity as I have. And they're not even following the same disciplines as I am. And in fact, there's another line over here of people that seem to follow very different disciplines and doing different things. And at that point, you have a choice on your hands. Would you still follow Jesus and keep your eyes on Him rather than get distracted by what this person might be doing or not doing? Or will you actually get distracted and start to define spirituality by what you did or didn't do and what was helpful for you in your relationship with Jesus? We need to be a people who follow Jesus and keep our eyes on Him. So I'm asking all of us here to do two things in this way. One, don't turn tools into rules. You don't need to help God out by putting up fences and making new rules for people that go beyond what God actually says. Communicate what God actually says, but don't make tools into rules. Whether those tools are around some spiritual practice or some spiritual experience or whatever it is, don't turn tools into rules, but by the disciplines you practice, but by the depth of your relationship with Jesus. And second thing, obey what God calls you to obey. Again, you don't need to help God out on this, but realize that true spirituality is not measured in the way you keep behind man-made fences, but in your obedience to what God actually says. I wonder if we can stand together. I'm going to pray for us in a moment. I love the way Paul sums up the Christian life. Not in a bunch of rules, but he says this. So Christ has truly set us free. Now make sure you stay free and don't get tied up again in slavery to the law. We're in relationship with Jesus. It's freeing. We're empowered by His Spirit to pursue Jesus and enjoy relationship with Him. That relationship will look different from one person to another. I'd like to ask you all 4 questions. I'm hoping you will shout loudly 2 no's to the first question and 2 yeses to the next 2 questions about who we as a church are and need to be. So here, want them really loud if this is kind of your commitment. Here at GCC, will we turn tools into rules? No. Here at GCC, will we put up unnecessarily flimsy fences that make it unnecessarily hard for people to follow after Jesus? No. Will we seek to obey what God calls us to obey? Yes. And will we make this a legalistic, free zone church? Yes. Let's pray together. Jesus, you've heard us today. Would your Spirit provide the freedom we need, reminding us of the joy we have in relationship with you. Help each one of us to pursue you and your call upon us. Help us to obey what you lay out for us to obey, but to give freedom and grace to each one here and each one around us. In Jesus' name, amen.